All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm Deputy Director for the Partnership for Strong Communities. And this year, Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting 3 days of sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around the critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues in our state. Join this conversation at hashtag CAHC 2021 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is titled Preserving Affordable Housing, Assessing Risks and Tracking Outcomes. And before I turn it over to our presenters, I'd like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their deep support has allowed this conference to happen again this year. And thank you to our collaborating sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rockport Mortgage. We have an armful of supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen, including Beacon Communities, Capital for Change, Corporation for Supportive Housing, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. And last but not least, a big thank you to the session sponsors for this session, Rockport Mortgage, Enterprise, Navigate, and POA. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded. We'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. This session may also be broadcast on CTN. All participants have been entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the speaker has asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel, and you can send that to PSC Zoom meetings, Chelsea Ross, and I will do my best to assist you. Your speakers today will let you know how they would like content questions to be submitted. And as this is our last session of today, just a heads up that tomorrow we will welcome Diane Yentl from the National Low Income Housing Coalition as a keynote. We have a full day of sessions covering everything from capacity building in the community development sector to development of mixed income, mixed use, and historic structures, including challenges overcome during the pandemic. We'll also host a discussion with members of the Housing, Planning, and Development Committees who will explore topics including bonding, housing development, zoning, COVID-related housing concerns, and more. So we hope that we will see all of your faces again here tomorrow. And with that, I will turn it over to Keely Stater.
Thank you, Chelsea. We're excited to be here and share a little bit about our work at PAHRC with you. Kelly and I will be presenting today. We work at the Public and Affordable Housing Research Corporation. I'm Keely Stater, the Director of Research, and I'll be presenting with Kelly McElwain, one of our research analysts. And just a note, this is actually my last day with PAHRC. I'll be moving on to a new opportunity. So if you do have questions, of course, you can put them in the chat today, but please follow up with Kelly by email later if you have questions later. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we're with PAHRC, and PAHRC is an independent research nonprofit that does research on the impact of affordable housing on people and places. We produce a number of research reports, which you can see below, and you can also explore on our site at pahrc.org. We also run the National Housing Preservation Database along with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we'll really be delving into that today as a resource for preservation. And with that, I'm going to take you to our outline in the next slide. So today we're going to cover first understanding preservations, the whats and the whys, and we'll move on to building preservation strategies, talking about how you can use local data and the National Housing Preservation Database to create a local preservation inventory to kind of track and monitor the supply in your community. And then last, we'll take you beyond preservation data, where we'll look at how you can connect preservation data, the affordable housing data that we'll show you today, to other data sets that track other outcomes, things like weather hazards and climate hazards, neighborhoods of opportunity, and some equity strategies as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Kelly to get us started.
Thanks, Keely. So I'm going to begin by kind of talking about why is preservation important. So a lot of you likely already know, but preserving affordable homes can protect valuable community infrastructure. As you know, building new affordable housing can be challenging and costly. So preservation efforts can really protect taxpayer dollars that are already invested in affordable rental homes. And it's often more cost effective than new construction. So it's a vital resource in making sure that our past investments remain accessible to low-income families. Federally assisted homes also have tight operating margins, so their limited reserves make it challenging to cover growing maintenance costs without continued support. And this is particularly true for aging buildings. It can also be true for naturally occurring affordable housing, which doesn't receive any capital or operating support. And by awarding a new subsidy to an affordable home, they can extend the amount of time that these homes are affordable and habitable to low-income families. Preservation can also protect tenants who otherwise may be forced to move. And homes assisted by federally assisted housing programs often serve communities' most vulnerable residents. And by preserving these homes, we can protect these families from displacement or hazardous living conditions. However, there are some risks that make preservation challenging. So the three most common risks that threaten preservation efforts include exit, depreciation, and appropriations risk. And any preservation strategy is going to need to address and evaluate some of these risks. And these risks can be bigger challenges for certain housing programs, and they can also be interrelated. Exit risk refers to the likelihood that federally assisted homes will lose their affordability restrictions. And this can happen if the property subsidies expire or if the owner chooses to opt out of their affordability restrictions. Depreciation risk refers to the degree to which the financial stability and the physical quality of affordable housing can deteriorate over time. And while appropriations risk refers to the degree at which funding is available to preserve affordable homes. And if funding isn't available for housing assistance programs or isn't renewed to keep pace with expanded need, these properties can face increasing depreciation or exit risks. So you can kind of see how these risks are interrelated. And really any preservation strategy is going to need to identify ways to identify properties that face these risks and strategies and tools to combat these different challenges. So the National Housing Preservation Database, or as I'll refer to as the NHPD, it can provide you with the data as a starting point to help you understand the federally assisted housing stock in your area. It can also help you investigate preservation risks and inform a preservation strategy. And I'll kind of share some of the research applications that we've used the NHPD for to give you an idea of how you can use it to assess some of those preservation risks that I talked about earlier. The NHPD is, it's a comprehensive deduplicated list of federally assisted rental properties across the US. So it makes it really valuable for communities across the country to identify where their affordable housing is and some of the characteristics of it. And the database includes information such as address, ownership characteristics, and funding characteristics. Some of that key information that it includes is the number of units that are assisted by each program and the specific start and end dates associated with each subsidy awarded and its affordability restrictions. And importantly, it includes information on properties assisted by 9 federally funded housing programs, such as LIHTC, Project-Based Section 8, Home Assistance, Section 202 Direct Loans, to name a few. And it also includes state-funded programs for 3 states, and one of those is Connecticut. So it's a great resource that it integrates information about federally assisted rental properties from a bunch of different sources. So it makes some of the data processing work easier for you to kind of start with to understand the housing stock in your community. And it's downloadable and you can access it at preservationdatabase.org. And it's free to nonprofits, government agencies, and individuals seeking housing assistance. And if we have time at the end of today's presentation, we kind of go through how you can access it, as well as some of the other tools that we'll be mentioning today. So we use data from the National Housing Preservation Database in our annual Picture of Preservation report. PAHRC produces this report annually in collaboration with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. The report specifically examined challenges to preserving affordable housing, strategies to keep homes affordable, and characteristics of recently lost affordable homes, and characteristics of recent preservation efforts. So to frame today's session, I'm going to give an overview of some of the key findings from our report, so you can see some of the ways that the NHPD can be used to track preservation risks and preservation benchmarks. And you can access the report on the website I mentioned earlier, preservationdatabase.org, under the reports tab. It's also linked here in the presentation. So to understand the extent that exit risk threatens long-term affordability, we looked at how many properties were facing upcoming affordability restriction expirations. And when we did this, we found that affordability restrictions are set to expire for 312,000 federally assisted rental homes across the US in the next 5 years. And most of these homes are assisted by LIHTC and project-based Section 8. However, the low-income housing tax credit program is expected to take up a growing share of the homes that are set to reach their affordability restriction expirations by the end of the decade. And that's just because the earliest properties that were awarded by this program are set to begin expiring. However, many of these properties often renew their assistance or secure funding to remain affordable. So just because they're facing upcoming affordability restriction expirations doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be gone for good. However, some of our research suggests that properties located in strong housing markets owned by profit-minded owners could be at greater risk for converting to market rate housing. Similarly, we've also seen that properties with renewable funding sources may also have an easier time continuing to remain affordable. So federally assisted housing programs can be assisted by a multitude of different programs, and they each kind of provide different funding incentives to make affordable housing pencil out. And programs like project-based Section 8 are renewable upon the expiration of a subsidy, which makes it a lot easier for the owner to continue to keep the property remaining affordable. Whereas some other programs like the low-income housing tax credit program are not renewable, meaning that once the affordability restrictions associated to the subsidy are set to expire, the owner must seek out new assistance to continue maintaining the property and keeping it affordable. So it adds another layer of complexity to the kind of maintenance of affordable homes. So that kind of these are some things that you can further assess in the NHPD and some of the other data that you track to further refine the true threat of exit risk. And later on, we'll talk about some of the characteristics you can access in the NHPD to do this. We also examined the extent that federally assisted homes could be lost due to disrepair. As I mentioned earlier, these properties operate on tight margins to meet program eligibility and affordability requirements. And this can cause them to deteriorate over time if rental income falls or if future funding is inadequate. And this has been a big challenge for public housing specifically. In the US, between 1996 and 2020, approximately 233,000 public housing homes were lost due to disrepair and were not replaced. Similarly, 23,000 homes assisted by project-based Section 8 were lost due to foreclosure or poor property conditions between 2005 and 2014, and this is in the US. So to understand the extent to which depreciation risk could threaten the long-term viability of federally assisted homes, we looked at how many public housing and Section 8 assisted properties were failing their latest REAC scores. And these REAC scores are assigned to properties based on an inspection that examines the frequency and severity of housing quality and safety deficiencies observed during an inspection. And we found that 23% of public housing homes and 4% of homes assisted by project-based Section 8 scored below 60 and failed their latest REAC inspection. And these properties likely require immediate investment to cover outstanding maintenance deficiencies and provide safe and healthy living conditions for residents. And beyond estimating how many properties could face preservation risks, we also wanted to understand how many properties have been preserved in recent years. We identified properties as recently preserved if they have been affordable for at least 5 years and were awarded a new subsidy in the NHPD over the past year. So this is something that you'd be able to track using the data that we have available to kind of benchmark preservation outcomes. And when we did this, we found that at least 129,000 federally assisted homes were preserved in recent years using federal resources. And 51,000 of these homes were preserved by receiving a new tax credit, and 47,000 were preserved by receiving a new HUD-insured mortgage. The remainder were preserved through a combination of either RED, Home, Section 515, 538, and the NPR demonstration. And if you're interested in learning more about some of the preservation mechanisms we studied, I recommend you check out Table 3 of our report to kind of learn more about how each of these programs work and their role in supporting preservation efforts. And finally, to better understand how the loss of federally assisted homes due to the preservation risks I mentioned earlier counterbalances new construction happening, we compared changes in the NHPD between 2019 and 2020. And while some of the homes added to the NHPD in 2020 were likely built a few years earlier, the NHPD can still be a resource to provide a glimpse into how the affordable housing stock is changing over time. And when we did this, we found that 99,000 new homes were added to HUD and NHPD data in 2020. But at the same time, 44,000 homes were lost. So this still resulted in a net gain of 55,000 homes added to the federally assisted housing stock across the US in 2020. And these gains were led by homes financed with LIHTC. And if you're interested in learning more about kind of some of the characteristics of the homes that were lost and like the kind of the suggested reasoning why they were lost, I recommend that you check out our report. It includes a lot of other great information that I didn't get to cover today, but it's really insightful to kind of look at preservation risks and the homes that were actually lost to kind of contextualize some of the risks that we're studying. So later on, I'll share how you can access some of the data that we examined in our picture preservation report in your area and how you can access the NHPD. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Keely, who's going to share some insight into how you can begin creating a preservation strategy.
Thank you, Kelly, for giving us a good idea of what we mean when we're talking about preservation and also why preservation is important. Now I'm going to take you through the how to build a preservation strategy. So we'll go to the next slide. So as you'll see, as you go through this process, the arrows can actually be pointing in some other directions as well. So you'll decide kind of what works for you locally. You might want to collect data and track outcomes at the same time, and those type of things. So this is just kind of a guide to get you started. So the first thing you'll want to do is get a comprehensive picture of the affordable housing in your area. And the best way to do that, to start doing that, is to access the NHPD, the National Housing Preservation Database, and search for the affordable housing in your community. And as Kelly mentioned, the NHPD contains almost all federally subsidized housing. So it won't have the naturally occurring housing. You'll be able to add that yourself, but it should have a pretty good comprehensive look at all the subsidized housing in your area that would be affordable to extremely low income families. So first you'll start by accessing the data, downloading the data to get a preservation inventory for your town. And then once you have those data set up, the next step probably is going to be to recruit some partners to help you. So you probably have a good idea already of who works in the housing space in your community and within the state, like the Partnership for Strong Communities, for instance. And really it's going to take a number of players in the funding space, the advocacy space, the data space, and other spaces, local government, to work together to truly be able to successfully preserve the affordable housing in your area. So this is where you'll look for the partners that will help you on your journey. And like I said, you might come back to this throughout the cycle. And then next, you're going to enhance the data. So as Kelly mentioned, we do have some local data for Connecticut, but you may be aware as you go through the comprehensive inventory of properties that are missing or information that needs to be updated. So you might add some new properties in there. You might add the naturally occurring affordable housing to your inventory. And you might also want to add some additional outcomes that you want to track that aren't currently in our database. We have a lot of location information, but as I'll mention in the final section, there may be some additional outcomes like risk, climate risk, or neighborhoods of opportunity that you also want to track in addition to just the housing stock and when it might lose its affordability. So you want to locate and add those data. And then you'll decide which outcomes that you want to track. As I mentioned, it may be more than the one Kelly explained earlier. It may be some of those resident outcomes as well. And you'll work with your partners to decide what those are and to set those up so that you can track them with the data that you have. And again, this may be something you revisit throughout the cycle as you get new partners or you get new data. And then finally, you'll create an action plan. So once we have these data, once we have our outcomes that we're going to track on our partners, what are we going to do to actually preserve housing? And this is where the funders come in and the advocacy comes in. How will we reach out to owners of properties that might be exiting affordable housing programs? How will we reach out to funders to provide that capital that these properties might need to continue to be affordable? So really creating your next steps in the what now of your preservation strategy. So next slide. So in case you didn't write all that down, on our website, we have some resources for you. Preservation, it's right there at the bottom, database.org. Under resources, we have this toolkit, which is really excellent in helping you through the steps of creating your preservation strategy, helping you access some critical data points that Kelly mentioned earlier. And it gives you some additional information on who to look to when you recruit partners, how to reach out to property owners that might have expiring rent restrictions, and then some different options for how you can invest in these properties. Do they need capital? Do they need tax abatements? How can we fund these properties and keep them affordable? And then what sort of policy should we be adopting in our town? Should we be adopting in Connecticut and nationally to encourage affordability and preservation? So you can access that toolkit at the URL there. And we also have some additional toolkits at just the preservation resources. HUD has some great toolkits on how to create a preservation strategy. I also think we have some there from LISC and some other partners. And there's even some on housing strategies of transit. So please visit our website and you can find more detailed guides on how to create your own local preservation strategy. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kelly, and she's going to get a little more detailed into that comprehensive inventory that I talked about a minute ago.
Thanks, Keely. And then just to add to what Keely was mentioning about the preservation toolkit, another really great resource that you can leverage here is that, or another great thing about this toolkit is that it can be customized to any geography of interest. So if you want to look at a town specifically, or the state, or a county, you'd be able to customize that toolkit, and it will include links to examples of how you can address each of these different preservation opportunities, and then it will summarize some key stats from the NHPD, such as the number of units expiring year over year, and then kind of funding characteristics. So definitely it's a great resource to check out if you're a little data hesitant, but would like to work with some data that's already been prepared.
It's not as hard as it sounds.
Yeah, it's really, it's not as hard as it sounds, but if you're still a little hesitant, definitely start with the toolkit, because some of the work is already done for you. So the strategy for going about and creating a local preservation inventory, you would begin by accessing the National Housing Preservation Database. And as I mentioned, this includes all federally assisted rental housing across the US. There's a few programs that it doesn't include, and those are typically just programs that address level data isn't collected for, either due to tenant privacy concerns or kind of the program was older and phased out long ago. And from there, you would want to filter the NHPD to your area of interest. We have a number of different geographic fields, such as the state, the city, census tract, county. So you can use that to further refine the list to kind of the area that you're looking at. We also include information on the latitude and longitude. So if your area of interest kind of overlaps a few different geographies, you'd be able to download that data and map those coordinates on to the region that you're interested in studying. And from there, you'd also want to filter out the NHPD to include properties that meet certain characteristics too. So the NHPD includes information on properties with active subsidies, meaning they are currently required to remain affordable to low-income families, and then properties that have inactive subsidies, meaning that the property was awarded the subsidy years ago, and in exchange for that subsidy, the owner promised to keep the property affordable for 20 years. And once that 20 years is passed, that subsidy will be inactive, but you can still access some of the historic funding information about the property to give you an insight about its prior funding history. But it's just another step to kind of note when you're analyzing the data that you might want to pull out some of those properties that are inactive. From there, you'll want to supplement the NHPD with any local housing and demographic data you have. So let's say you have a list of properties that were awarded some locally funded subsidy in your community or had some special state assistance. We do include information on some state funded subsidies in the NHPD, but we don't have any funding that would have been awarded by a town. So if you have any information on that, that would be great to supplement it with. And then you can also supplement it with additional data fields that we might not have in the NHPD, such as parcel. And then you can link to additional community demographic data using the census tract ID to further give you a picture about the characteristics of each property. And then from there, you'd want to develop your criteria to identify at-risk properties. So a bunch of communities do things differently. In our preservation toolkit that Keely had described, we linked to a number of examples of affordability assessments that communities have engaged in. So you can take a look at some of the factors that they have used to define their at-risk properties. Oftentimes, it's a combination of the date at which the subsidies are set to expire for the property. So if the subsidies are set to expire in the next 5 years, that would generally mean it's at risk. And then they'll further refine it to look at a combination of the property having a for-profit owner or it being in a strong market or an opportunity area to kind of make sure that that housing isn't lost, since it would be a lot harder to recoup and replace that should the housing be lost. So you can use, as I mentioned, you can use the NHPD to explore these preservation outcomes. And I kind of listed some of the key preservation outcomes that you could track in the NHPD and some criteria that you can use to do that. So we identify properties at risk of losing their affordability restrictions by examining whether the property's latest end date is within the next 5 years. And you can further refine this list to examine which properties demonstrate factors that could increase the likelihood of loss. And many properties, as I mentioned earlier, particularly those with renewable assistance, will continue to remain affordable once these restrictions expire because they have the option to renew it. But research suggests that properties could face heightened exit risk if they have a for-profit owner, they're older, if they haven't received a new subsidy recently, have a non-renewable subsidy, or have a failing REAC inspection score. So the great thing about the NHPD is that you'll be able to kind of estimate the latest date at which a property receives some type of capital subsidy. So you can estimate when the property may have recently been rehabbed, and you can also estimate when the property came online by looking at the earliest date out to which the property was awarded a subsidy as well. You can also use the NHPD to identify whether properties could need a capital investment by searching for those that have a failing REAC score. And properties and REAC scores are failing if they're 60 or below. The only challenge with this is that REAC scores are only collected for properties that are assisted by the public housing program or project-based Section 8. So it's available for about half of properties. It provides a lot of insight, but again, this is an area where any additional local data that you may have would be really valuable, whether it's data on code enforcements that a local town might have, that could provide a lot of valuable insight into the potential need for capital investment. Another way you can use the NHPD to identify whether a property is in need of capital investment is by examining the date which properties last received a capital subsidy. And that you could just basically take the latest date at which a subsidy was awarded to a property. And if it hasn't occurred recently, then you know that it might be time for, or it might require an additional investment in the coming future. And finally, you can also track preservation outcomes by searching for properties that are at least 5 years old and that have received a new capital subsidy in the past couple of years. And this is something that we've recently started exploring in the NHPD in our recent picture preservation report. So there's some guidelines in the appendix of our report. If this is something that you're interested in analyzing for your community, we're happy to meet and kind of give some insight into how we've analyzed this. And a data tool that I'll be sharing in a minute will kind of include some of the data that we kind of aggregated and analyzed in that report, which you could leverage. So to further support tracking preservation efforts, you can link the NHPD to additional community and resident data, as I had mentioned earlier. So I listed some of the fields from the NHPD that you could use to do this linking. So the census tract field can help you link to neighborhood census data, such as the neighborhood poverty rate or the neighborhood median gross rent to give an idea of the strength of the market in that area, or even demographic characteristics of the community that the property is located in. You can also link the property to eligibility for funding incentives, such as opportunity zones, qualified census tracts, and low to moderate income areas using that census tract field. And then we also have larger levels of geography as well, such as county and CVSA, if that's something that interests you. You can also link the HUD property ID field in the NHPD to capture additional data on property level resident characteristics. And this is really great and something that we've leveraged in our research. And this has allowed us to kind of look at racial equity as well. So this is a great resource to kind of dive a little deeper and look at equity issues. So the information that you can match to using that HUD property ID includes information on the percentage of households at the property that are headed by a person of color, an adult over the age of 62, an individual with a disability, and the percent of households at that property that include children. And this can help you target preservation efforts to vulnerable populations or assess equity across different metrics. And this is something we looked at in our recent report, Taking Stock, where we looked at exposure to, or potential exposure to natural hazards for federally assisted rental properties and compared it across properties by the race of the household head. And you can access this resident characteristics data from the HUD's picture of subsidized households, which I linked to here. It's not going to be available for all properties. It's just going to be available for properties that receive rental assistance. So that could include public housing and project-based Section 8. But again, it's a really valuable resource. Additionally, the address and property name fields in the NHPD can be a resource to help you link the NHPD data to any proprietary data that you have. And this can include parcel data, records of locally funded preservation efforts, and code enforcement, and really any other data on that would be able to link to property name or address. And finally, you can use the NHPD property ID to match the current version of the NHPD to prior versions to examine some of those changes over time that I had mentioned. So another tool that tangential to the NHPD that can help you locate properties facing preservation risks and assess preservation challenges in your area is our Picture of Preservation Report Mapping tool. And this tool can help you search for properties. It can basically help you answer the following questions that are listed here. And it references all of the data that we analyzed in our recent picture preservation report. So specifically, you can locate which properties have upcoming affordability restriction expirations, how many properties have failing REAC scores by state. It will map out which properties have recently been lost from the NHPD if you want to examine where the properties have been lost. It can also help you answer how many homes have lost their affordability restrictions early by state. This is something that we looked at in our report to drill down and better understand why some of these homes were lost. And it can also help you answer how many homes could be lost if current trends continue and preservation efforts aren't expanded, and which properties have been preserved in recent years. So you can find the link here. It's also available on our website. But for now, I'm going to pass it off to Keely, or pass it back to Keely to talk about some additional data that you can use to track outcomes beyond affordable housing preservation.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So as we mentioned, there's a lot of resources in the NHPD as far as tracking preservation outcomes. and assessing preservation risk, but you may want to track other outcomes depending on what's important to your community and how you want to address your affordable housing issues. Here are some additional resources that we have used in the past, not limited to these, but again, the preservation database allows you to match the data with other data. So one thing that we did, we wanted to understand neighborhoods of opportunity. So we wanted to understand how to invest in affordable housing in neighborhoods that might offer more resources to their residents. And we also wanted to understand how to leverage the resources that are in current neighborhoods where there is opportunity or where there already is affordable housing. So how can we kind of elevate that opportunity for the residents that are living there? So kind of a place-based strategy as well as a strategy that allows people to choose where they live at the same time. And so we created another database, which you can access at the URL below, that created indicators that measured the amount of opportunity. And when we mean opportunity, we really just mean resources that are in there. Specifically, we looked at educational opportunity by looking at how well the schools were performing, the school proficiency index, the student-teacher ratio of the closest school to the affordable housing property, or the average of the census tract. So is there a lower or higher student-teacher ratio? Are the children going to be able to get that teacher, get their time and attention and do better in school with more teacher attention? Percent of 11th and 12th graders that took the SAT or ACT. So are students at that school looking to go to college and advance their education? And the percent of 3 to 4-year-olds that are enrolled in school. So investments in early education, which has been shown to lead to better educational outcomes and later household incomes for people. So how can people access economic opportunity? So one is through education, labor market access itself. So looking at how many workers work locally. So the percent of workers with less than 30-minute commute, the job density index. So how many jobs there are located in a specific area, the labor force participation, how many people are able to work in that specific area, unemployment, and then percent of the population 25 years or more with a high school degree or more, to kind of look at the labor market capital in that area. Then we also looked at transit access. How many people commute via public transportation? Is that transportation working for the people that live in that neighborhood? Average commute time to work, are they working locally again? The distance to the middle of the central city that it's located close to, how far away is it from things? And then also the percent of households with at least one vehicle. So if it's far away, do people have vehicles to get to work, to get to amenities, to get to school, things they need? And then finally, we looked at health. So we looked at the cancer risk index, the chance that the tract has low food access. So is it close to grocery stores? How old the homes are, is it potentially subject to lead paint issues, investments in repair, things like that. Proximity to a site with an EPA risk management plan, and that just means some type of manufacturing plant that might need a plan in case something went wrong with the materials they had there that they were working with, and then primary care doctors per person in that area. So we put all these things together, we standardized them, put together, and created an index we call opportunity capital. And using the tool below, you can get the overall opportunity score for that neighborhood, or you can drill down into these factors, whatever is important to your residents or the people in your community. So if you're looking to build a family building, or you're looking to preserve a family building, looking to see how are the schools in that area, how is transit in that area, what's the labor market like, so you can kind of pick and choose. And then we created some investment strategies that you'll see over on the left by combining that opportunity with some of those market indicators that Kelly talked about earlier. What are the value of the homes in the area, and then how has this been changing over time? So do we think that this is going to be a better, stronger market or not? And based on those things, we created some investment strategies in terms of investing in places, and then also investing in new places that low-income families might want to live in, might want to have that choice to be able to live where they want to live in good neighborhoods that offer the resources that they want. So This is something that you can use to pair with the NHPD, and this is an outcome that you can track in your own preservation plan, looking at the amount of affordable housing in neighborhoods of opportunity, and then also tracking how much opportunity are we bringing to areas that may have had fewer resources, but house a lot of our affordable housing properties. And it's important to be able to invest in those areas as well. Next slide. Another thing that we looked at was, oh, excuse me. So this is the tool. You can go to this URL, which was the same on the other page, and go in, and there's a map that allows you to navigate. And then if you contact us, we can send you the data that if you want to pair it with the NHPD data for your community, and we'll post our contact information. And as I mentioned, Kelly will be our contact as I'll be leaving for a new opportunity. So this is where you will go to find the data that I just mentioned. Next slide. So another report that we did and other data that we paired with the NHPD was in relation to natural hazard and climate risk. So we used the National Risk Index, which had been created by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and that includes 18 different natural hazards. So it includes coastal flooding, hurricane, fire, earthquakes, volcanoes, and 18 ice, heat, a lot of different risks that are associated with climate change, like heat, and coastal flooding, and also just weather events that we have here in Connecticut. And it does some really interesting mathematical calculus to come up with an overall risk index, and that risk index includes kind of the financial part, which is the expected annual loss, and a social part, which kind of considers how the people living in that community might face a natural hazard. So how easily is it for them to get out, to get help, to recover? And then community resilience, that looks at the entire community. Does the community have good evacuation routes? Do they already have an emergency plan? What sort of resources do they have in the community? So how well will the community recover? So it takes all that into account. And we looked at where the affordable housing was located in relation to high risk areas in terms of potential natural hazards and climate events. And that is also something that you could pair with your local housing data. So you can use our mapping tool, which again shows you where the housing properties are, the federally subsidized housing properties, and then it shows the different types of risk that they might be experiencing. And this is again data that we could share with you that you could map onto your local comprehensive housing inventory. And then yeah, so this is another thing that might be part of your outcomes that you want to track. How susceptible is our community to climate change, and how susceptible is our affordable housing to climate change? So again, something of interest. Next slide. And then another important part of taking additional data and mapping it onto your affordable housing inventory is ensuring that you incorporate equity into your tracking outcomes and monitor equity outcomes as well as the preservation outcomes. So these are some of the things that we've learned in our work, and some different data sets that you can use to incorporate equity. As Kelly mentioned, the NHPD can be connected to census data, so you can access demographic information, and then you can also connect it to demographic data about specific properties that will show you who lives there. And those are two data sources that you can use to understand different rates of success and impact for different demographic groups in your communities. So one thing we've learned is kind of looking at equity as a goal rather than a byproduct. So instead of saying, here's our tracking inventory, the outcomes we're going to track in terms of housing preservation, and then later looking at how does this match up to equity, making equity a goal when you create your initial outcomes that you want to track, and figuring out what that looks like for a community. So if we're going to make equity a goal, what are the success measures that we want that show that we're achieving equitable outcomes in our affordable housing stock and in our community? So really seeing it as a goal. A lot of times housing is very transactional, real estate transactions. And because these transactions happen within a system that already has inequity baked into it, the outcomes of these simple transactions also lead to more inequity. So it's very important to kind of move beyond the transactions and see how they may reproduce inequity. And then, as I mentioned, building equity into outcome evaluation itself. So one way that we can do it is by matching those data from different demographic groups and looking at success rates. Are the success rates different? Are we housing Black and brown families at the same rate that we're housing white families or Asian families or Latino families? Why or why not? And really just looking at the differences in success rates would be one quantitative way to understand, and then digging deeper and finding out why, we're not achieving equity in our communities. And then another thing to also include are qualitative measures in your outcomes. So not only are the success rates, the numbers similar, but we really want to look at whether the process is similar. So groups might be achieving the same outcomes, but it might have been a lot harder for one group to achieve the outcome than the other. So we also want to look at process as well as outcome, like end results. And then we also want to include lived experiences as benchmarks. So talking to people with lived experiences to understand the process, to understand, how we can do better and promote equity within the preservation process and the process of increasing affordable housing and serving our community and meeting its needs. So those are some thoughts that we have had in our work in regards to incorporating equity into preservation strategies and affordable housing strategies for communities. And with that, we'll open it up for Q&A. I think we have a few minutes left. You can go ahead and type your Q&A into the chat. I see we have one question about energy needs, energy benchmarking. That's a great question. We did not touch on that, but that is absolutely something that would be great to add into your local preservation database to try to understand the systems that are included in some of these properties, if they're outdated and need to be replaced, the square footage, the energy usage. I know that we've had some discussions. There are companies out there that specifically track energy use and do energy benchmarking for affordable housing. But we've had some discussions with them, and I think locally you may be able to get some of that information for free from your local energy providers. But certainly there are companies out there that do that, and this would be great data to match with preservation data. Are there other questions? I think I see a note on here about making sure that we allow people to live wherever they want to live and not just focus our efforts on single neighborhoods where there already is a lot of affordable housing, and that's certainly true. Investing in places and also giving people opportunity to move where they want to live is important in preservation. With the neighborhood opportunity search tool, you'd be able to kind of locate affordable housing that is in neighborhoods with better resources, and really you could target those properties as a priority for investment or as a priority for preservation. Any other questions? Do we have any workshops planned for the use of the database? That's a great idea. We don't currently. We do have some tutorials, I believe. We used to on the website. Kelly, do we still have those?
Yeah,
up
we
on
still
the
have
website?
tutorials on the website. If you're interested in workshops, definitely follow up with me in an email and we'll keep you posted on any future ones that are planned. And then if you register to access the NHPD, you'll be added to our mailing list and we'll hear about any future events or webinars planned. That's a great idea.
And I realize we did not put our contact information up on this question side, but I am typing Kelly's email into the chat so that you can follow up with her should you have questions. Great. I think we have just a couple more minutes. We can keep it open. Oh, I see we have a lot of another question. Can you say more about the links between housing and transit? Desegregate CT just released a report on transit and found that despite government's massive investment, many local governments don't allow multifamily housing around those stations to be built easily. Yes, absolutely. And also many have a large minimum lot size. So yes, you can definitely add transit and overlay transit data with the affordable housing data we have in the National Housing Preservation Database. That is something we have not really done beyond the transit indicators we have in the opportunity tool that just tells you how often people use it. And, you know, generally giving you a feel for if it's used within the area. We do on our preservationdatabase.org website /resources. We do have one guidebook that's specifically designed to preserve and I think also encourage building of affordable housing around transit stations. So you could look there for some pointers on that. Transit data is a little bit hard to get nationally, so we haven't delved into that with the NHPD, but certainly locally it would be a lot easier to add. So you could map out where your transit is, where you would need transit based on the location of your affordable housing properties. And you can also look and see if you put the opportunity tool with the housing locations where there is transit, but people aren't using it. I heard a story about Houston before they redesigned their transit system. You know, there'd be a bus stop in a neighborhood, but nobody would use it. So it's important to make sure that the transit is designed around how people use it as well. So those would be good resources to kind of encourage that conversation and provide data that would help make those conversations easier. Kelly, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great research application using the NHPD. I've also seen work done where the information about the different transit lines is mapped and overlaid with affordable housing properties to identify where those investments are and then where gaps might exist. And it's also incorporated into future planning when additional transit opportunities are added. So certainly something to consider in preservation planning.
Yeah, and I think just to touch back on that point about usage, I think we've also heard a lot where there might be a transit stop, but it stops, the bus stops, the last stop is like at 5 o'clock and people who have jobs after 5 o'clock can't use it. So adjusting the schedule to meet the people's needs as well. So.
And then the labor market, like the types of markets that they're working in, like if there's a train that goes down to New York City where residents are generally working locally, the schedule might not necessarily meet the needs of the residents in those communities too.
Yeah, and there's another point about transit that you know we could make areas opportunity areas by building transit around affordable housing. So kind of that investing in communities as well. You still want to invest in place and bring transit to place to make it an opportunity area. So that's a good point. All right, well, I think we just have 1 minute left. Thank you all for your questions and your interest, and feel free to reach out to Kelly with any follow-up questions.
Thank you, Keely and Kelly. Really, really great information. And we will make sure that we post the recording. And it sounds like lots of folks are going to be getting in touch with you, Kelly. I'm going to drop, Kaylee did before, but dropped registration links in for tomorrow and Wednesday for the conference. But we'll kick off tomorrow at 9:30. I'm hearing from Diane Yentl, and we hope to see all of you back here at the conference. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.